Buenos Aires was a thing of the past, and the English Channel was to be reached quickly in 4 weeks. But there was an unexpected event. Listen to the following report 33. Mayday for a troop of penguins. With brisk northeast winds blowing, we had left the Rio de La Plata on east course. Downright 500 nautical miles had been sailed in 36 hours when the radio operator reported to the officer on watch, Mayday, meaning distress, come help me, has been received from the Argentine research vessel Gran Salvador. That was yesterday morning. The captain was called immediately and the needs of the Argentinians were explained. Although the ship itself is not in danger, but the 133 penguins on board are. There is food for just 2 days for them on board. Because of difficulties with the engine, they could only steam at 4 knots to the first port and the penguin station. It would take at least 5 days. The request was to bring the penguins to a large tabular iceberg floating around 200 nautical miles away in south-southeast direction. There they would be picked up in the next 2 to 3 weeks' time. The ship's command was willing to help, but saw no possibility to get the penguins on board with the help of our cargo load gear. How could you tie a lash around the belly of a penguin and take him on board hanging on a cargo hook? The request had almost been rejected, but then there was clarified whether the transfer could take place in calm seas, and further on whether the penguins could go upstairs with steps of 10 centimeters height. If both requests were positive, we would only need to deploy our gangway and the visitors could come aboard. After the Gran Salvador signaled that would be no problem, our course was redrawn and we sailed to the meeting point about 55 nautical miles away. 3 hours later the gangway was deployed and the wind grew weaker, and at low speed in almost calm seas we arrived late afternoon at the location of the research vessel. This was at best just a small fishing trawler, but there were at least 24 researchers and 10 dozen penguins on deck with heads erect. By removing our sails, we reduced speed to just 2 knots, so that the steamer could come alongside and the transfer could begin. One after another, the animals were gently placed on our gangway, and with coaching and a gentle nudge, they waddled around 5 meters up until they stood on our deck. They were distributed equally, 40 in front, center, and aft respectively. Then we dragged the fish stocks on deck and at once to the forecastle, because they had already smelled something. The Gran Salvador said goodbye and gave us a hint where we should set out the penguins. Then they steamed away in a western course. We also changed to the new course and set all sails. Never had our work been observed with such a great interest by our guests. They did not only watch, but did something helpful in the meantime. If we pulled a rope from the top down, their heads were moving up and down. When a sheet was pulled from left to right, their heads moved from left to right. When we turned a crack clockwise, they turned the head around toward the right side. Hard to guess what happened when it was turned around to the left. They stood together in groups of 5 to 10 animals. They were often closer to the event and work than we were, but always in the middle. It was initially quite good, but it was also dangerous because those at least 1 meter tall guests violated fundamentally all health and safety regulations. The ship command was convinced that after a long night it could no longer go on like this. This was understood. All sails were recovered, and we motored the remaining hours to the tabular iceberg. Just before noon, it became severely cold, and a few hours later we spotted a giant iceberg in grey weather. Everyone wanted to see its dimension, and even the chief and his cook mates climbed the foremast up to 50 meters height to admire the huge plate. However, because of the bitter cold, we wanted to get away from here as quickly as possible. Only our penguins grunted happily. We headed for a fracture point from where our guests could easily climb the plateau. Then they were taken in the arm of the two starboard watches sailors and released head first down into the sea. You got warm handling the second penguin and started sweating with the third one. In less than half an hour the departure was completed. Shortly after that we saw the entire squad of the iceberg ashore with their fins waving just like hamburger people on the arrival of ships on the Elbe. Super cool. One of the port watch sailors had by now fished several large chunks of ice from the sea and placed them on the poop deck. A small fresh water supply which was sufficient for the next few days. After 12 hours later, we enjoyed warmer temperatures again. This is it. I am sitting on deck and have written my notes about Buenos Aires and the penguins in my scratchbook. This is the end of this story. Cheers.